There is a moment just before a man loses everything when the world goes very quiet. Not peaceful, not calm, quiet the way a held breath is quiet, the way a house goes quiet after the phone rings at 2 in the morning and you already know before you answer that nothing will be the same on the other side of that call. Everett Calloway knew that quiet well. He had been living inside it for 2 years. But what the man in the black SUV coming up his gravel driveway did not know, what no one in a tailored suit and Italian leather shoes ever seems to know when they roll up to a working man's door, is that quiet is not the same as defeated. Sometimes quiet is just a man who has finished reading. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is for the stories they don't put in the news. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss one. The Calloway land sat in a fold of the Appalachian Hills like something the mountains had decided to keep for themselves. 480 acres of bottom ground and timber slope in Harlan County, West Virginia, running along the east fork of a creek that didn't have an official name on any state map, but that every family in the valley had called Sycamore Run for as long as anyone could remember. The deed on that land had been signed in 1903 by Everett's great-grandfather, a Welsh immigrant named Cormac Calloway, who had come to the coalfields with nothing but a strong back and a suspicion of banks that, as it turned out, was entirely warranted. Cormac had worked the mines for 11 years, saved every dollar he didn't spend on food, and bought the land outright in cash from a timber company that was moving its operations north. No mortgage, no liens, no bank holding paper over his head. That was the way it stayed for 3 generations. Everett was 61 years old in the summer the drought came. He was a thick-built man, not tall but solid, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same hickory as the axe handles in his barn. He had spent 22 years as a mining engineer for Consolidated Carbon before the Harlan No. 4 seam played out and the company moved on without ceremony the way companies do. He had transitioned to farming the way men of his generation transitioned to most things, without complaint, without drama, by simply learning what needed to be learned and doing what needed to be done. His wife Dorothea had made the transition with him. Dot, everyone called her. She had kept the books tended, the kitchen garden, raised their 2 sons, who now lived in Lexington, and called on Sundays, and maintained a personal policy of reading every document placed in front of her before signing it. She called it her grandmother's rule. Her grandmother had signed away a piece of land in eastern Kentucky in 1962 because she hadn't read the mineral rights clause, and the family had watched a coal company pump the earth out from under their house for the next 30 years. The small print, Dot used to say, settling into the chair by the kitchen window with her reading glasses and a pencil, is where they hide the truth. She had been gone 3 years now. A fast cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate. She left behind 2 sons, a paid-off farmhouse, a freezer full of labeled venison and preserves, and a brown leather journal, worn soft as skin at the corners, that she had kept for the last 15 years of her life. Everett kept it on the kitchen table. He hadn't been able to move it anywhere else. The summer of 2021 turned cruel by the end of June. The creek dropped to a trickle by the 4th of July, exposing flat stones that were normally 2 feet under water. The pasture grass went yellow, then gray, then simply stopped. The air above the fields shimmered in a way Everett hadn't seen since the dry summer of 1988, a heat that didn't just sit on you, but pressed as if the sky were slowly lowering itself onto the earth. By mid-August, the West Virginia Department of Agriculture had issued a formal drought emergency declaration for 11 counties. Harlan was among them. Everett stood at the fence line that separated his east field from the gravel road, working a handful of topsoil between his fingers. It turned to powder and lifted away on a breath of wind before it reached the ground. He watched it go. Behind him, the old apple tree in the corner of the yard, planted by Everett Calloway in 1931, when the Depression had stripped everything else bare, held its fruit stubbornly small and hard and green, as if it understood that letting go too early was not an option. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened Dot's journal to the last page she had written, the page he returned to when he needed to remember what he was doing any of this for. "Don't let them take this land, Ev. It isn't ours to give away." He closed the journal. He poured himself a cup of coffee. He looked out the window at the dry, silent fields and thought about what was coming. He had known it was coming for a while. Consolidated Harvest Bank had arrived in Harlan County the way most corporate things arrive in small Appalachian towns, quietly, incrementally, then all at once. They had begun 3 years earlier by purchasing a small regional holding company in Charleston, which itself owned 3 community banks across the southern coalfield counties. Then they bought Blackwater Valley Savings and Trust, the oldest bank in Harlan, established 1908, the institution that had held mortgages and farm accounts for families in the valley for over a century. The acquisition had been announced in the Harlan Daily Enterprise in a 2-paragraph notice on page 7. Most people missed it. Everett had not. He had cut the notice out and pinned it to the corkboard above his desk next to the property tax receipt and the water rights summary and a photo of Dot laughing at something off camera at a church picnic in 2016. By the following spring, the old Blackwater Valley branch on Main Street had been repainted and rebranded. The tellers were the same local people, but the management had changed, replaced by men from the regional office in Charleston who wore clothes that looked too clean for the county and spoke with the particular careful cheerfulness of people who have been trained to deliver bad news warmly. Conrad Ashby was the regional vice president for Appalachian acquisitions. He was 42, lean in the way of a man who eats at his desk with a smile that appeared on cue and stayed slightly too long. He wore a navy suit to the Harlan County Farm Bureau meeting in late August, like a man who had read about farmers but never stood in a field. Everett was in the back row when Ashby took the podium. The pitch was called the Heritage Land Relief Program, lower initial payments, cash injection for operating costs, consolidation of equipment debt, a streamlined process designed to help farming families weather the current uncertainty, which was the phrase Ashby used 4 times in 12 minutes, always with the same practiced pause before uncertainty, as if the word itself deserved a moment of sympathy. The room was full of men who were scared. Everett could see it in the way they leaned forward when Ashby mentioned the lower payments. Fear and hope occupy almost the same posture. Dale Wickham signed the sign-up sheet on the way out. The Gentry brothers put their names down before Ashby had finished collecting his papers. In the parking lot under a bleached August sky, Ray Pruitt fell into step beside Everett. Ray had been Everett's neighbor for 30 years. They had traded equipment and labor through 2 generations of farming and 1 mine closure. Ray was the kind of man who showed up without being asked when something needed doing, hauling hay, fixing fence line, sitting with you in the hospital waiting room without needing to say anything. Everett trusted him the way you trust someone you have worked alongside in physical difficulty, which is a particular and deep kind of trust. "You going to look at the heritage program?" Ray asked, hands in his pockets, eyes on the parking lot. "I'm going to look at the document," Everett said. "It's a good rate, Ev. Dale thinks it'll carry him through to next harvest." Dale signed before he read it. Most of these are pretty standard. The bank's been doing them across the region. Then reading it won't take long. Ray nodded slowly. There was something in the way he nodded, not disagreement exactly, but a faint stiffness, a slight delay before the motion that Everett noticed the way he noticed most things. Without comment, filed away. He didn't think much more about it that evening, but 3 weeks later, driving home from the feed store past the Consolidated Harvest branch on Main Street, he saw Ray's truck in the parking lot. It was 9:40 at night. The branch closed at 5. Everett slowed. He read the plate to make sure. He drove home. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time, not thinking about the heritage program, not thinking about the drought. Thinking about the way Ray had nodded. The Heritage Land Relief contract arrived by certified mail on the 15th of September, 380 pages, in a white cardboard envelope along with a cover letter from Conrad Ashby's office, noting that the promotional interest rate would expire on the 1st of October and that signing could be completed at the Main Street branch at the customer's earliest convenience. 3 yellow adhesive flags marked the signature pages. Sign here, initial here, final acknowledgement on the back cover. Everett set the envelope on the kitchen table and looked at it the way a man looks at an engine he doesn't yet understand, with patience, with the understanding that somewhere in there every gear had a purpose. He made a pot of coffee. He found the reading glasses he kept in the drawer with the flashlight batteries. He opened Dot's journal to a blank page near the back and set it beside the contract with a pencil. He began on page 1. The first 50 pages were exactly what he expected. Standard loan language payment schedules formatted to obscure the compound interest architecture buried in the footnotes, prepayment penalties written in a font so small he needed a magnifying glass to confirm they were there, clauses that assigned dispute arbitration to a firm in Columbus, Ohio, making any legal challenge expensive before it began, equipment seizure provisions that allowed the bank to repossess machinery after a single missed payment without a court order. The machinery clause was written in passive voice, which was the contract writing equivalent of a man shrugging while he takes your wallet. Everett noted each item in the margin with the date, a brief description, and a small asterisk. Dot's system. He read until midnight. He slept 4 hours. He made more coffee. The second night, pages 80 through 210. Subordination clauses. Force majeure provisions that absolved the bank of responsibility under circumstances listed so broadly. They essentially included weather markets and the general passage of time. Indemnification language that looped back on itself like a knot designed to tighten under pressure. At 2 in the morning, he found a section governing the rights of beneficiaries in the event of the primary borrower's death. He read it 3 times. It meant that if Everett died before the loan was paid off, his sons would inherit the debt at the adjusted rate, not the promotional rate. They would have 90 days to refinance or surrender the property. He wrote 3 asterisks in the margin, circled it, said nothing. The third night he made the coffee stronger. He had developed over the 2 previous nights a methodology for the document, moving through it the way he had once moved through a mineshaft inspection, systematically section by section, testing each structural element before trusting his weight to it. By 9 o'clock on the third night, he was in the addenda. Supplemental provisions, regional compliance appendices, historical charter acknowledgements. Most of it was dense regulatory language, the textual equivalent of wallpaper present everywhere, noticed by no one. He almost missed it. Addendum 9 ran for 3 pages, beginning at the bottom of page 312. The header read, Supplemental provisions for properties held under legacy, agricultural charter designation, Blackwater Valley Savings and Trust, charter established 1908, Commonwealth of Virginia / West Virginia, Partition Act, Succession. The font was 8-point. Even with the magnifying glass, Everett had to lean forward until his nose was 6 inches from the page. He read the first paragraph, and then he stopped. He took off his glasses. He cleaned them on his flannel shirt. He put them back on. He read the paragraph again. In the event of default and subsequent foreclosure proceedings initiated upon a property held under legacy agricultural charter designation, if the initiating creditor has held mortgage interest in said property for a period of less than 18 months from the date of origination, the creditor assumes full fiduciary liability for stewardship replacement value. Said value shall be calculated as the highest appraised fair market value of the subject property recorded within the preceding 15 fiscal years, inclusive of all assessable mineral timber and agricultural yields. This replacement value shall be disbursed in full to the grantor as severance compensation prior to the execution of any eviction, seizure, or transfer of title. Everett set the magnifying glass down. His hands were still, his breathing was steady. He had the quality of stillness that belongs to men who have spent decades working around high-voltage equipment, the stillness of someone who understands that the wrong reaction at the wrong moment costs everything. He reached for Dot's journal and wrote in pencil in the careful block letters he used when something mattered. Addendum 9-D, replacement value. Highest appraised, 15 years. He underlined it once. Then he put the pencil down and sat back in his chair and let the meaning of what he had found settle through him the way cold water settles slowly, completely, all the way to the bottom. The Consolidated Harvest Bank had been in possession of Blackwater Valley Savings and Trust for 26 months. When their legal team in Columbus had assembled the Heritage Land Relief contract package, they had copy-pasted the full Blackwater Valley Charter compliance section into the addenda to satisfy the state requirement that legacy charter provisions be preserved in all successor loan agreements. It was the kind of task assigned to a junior paralegal on a Friday afternoon, the kind of work reviewed by no one because it was assumed to be merely regulatory padding. What they had copy-pasted was a clause written in 1936 by a Blackwater Valley Board chairman named Edward Tilghman, who had watched banks strip his community bare during the Depression and had spent 3 months crafting a provision designed to make foreclosure on legacy agricultural land so expensive that a creditor would think very carefully before pulling the trigger. The Consolidated Harvest legal team had included it in 380 pages of fine print, and they had almost certainly not read it. But there was one more thing. Everett flipped back through the addendum. He found it on the second page, paragraph 4. This provision shall be binding and enforceable upon both parties, upon the acknowledgment signature of the grantor on the corresponding addendum, acknowledgment page, page 313. He turned to page 313. It was a standard acknowledgment form, 6 lines of boilerplate, and at the bottom 2 signature blocks. The bank's block was already signed initials from someone in the Columbus office dated 2 weeks prior. The grantor's block, his block was blank. Everett understood immediately what this meant and what it required. If he signed the main contract without signing page 313, a sharp attorney could argue he hadn't formally acknowledged the addendum, reducing it to disputed boilerplate. The provision would become a legal gray area, potentially a fight, but not a certainty. If he signed page 313, the clause became irrefutable. Both parties acknowledged, both parties bound. He also understood that this page could not stand out. If page 313 bore a lone deliberate signature in a document otherwise unsigned page by page, any bank attorney worth his billing rate would question the selective acknowledgment. Everett needed the page to look like every other page. He picked up his pen. He went to page 1 and began initialing every page of the addenda section. Page 290, 291, 292, methodical, unhurried. The same way Dot used to go through the grocery receipts on Sunday evenings, checking every line without complaint, because that was what you did when the numbers mattered. He reached page 312 and initialed it. He turned to 313 and signed the acknowledgment block in full. His initials went into the margin next to paragraph 4, the same as every other page. He kept going to the end of the addenda. Then he went back through the main document and initialed the flag pages Ashby had marked. He signed the final page. He set the pen down. He closed the contract. He looked at the clock. It was 3:14 in the morning. Outside the night was perfectly still. The drought had taken even the sound of the creek. Somewhere in the darkness the old apple tree stood in the yard, holding its hard green fruit patient as anything. Everett opened Dot's journal. He read the last line she had written one more time. "Don't let them take this land, Ev. It isn't ours to give away." He closed the journal. He set the signed contract neatly on top of the manila envelope it had arrived in. He went to bed. He slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who has finished a job correctly. On Friday morning, he drove to the Main Street branch of Consolidated Harvest Bank. Conrad Ashby was waiting with a handshake and an expression of professional relief. "Glad you came in, Everett. I know it's a big decision." Everett placed the contract on Ashby's desk. Ashby picked it up, turned it over, checked the back page for the final signature. He noted the initialed margins with a brief approving glance, the gesture of a man who takes meticulous paperwork as a sign of good faith, and set it in his out tray. "Funds will be available Monday morning. Welcome to the Heritage Program." Everett adjusted his cap. "Thank you, Conrad." He walked out into the flat September heat. He got into his truck. He did not drive home immediately. He sat for a moment with the engine idling, looking at the dry street, the shuttered storefronts, the hand-lettered signs in windows that read "Closed and for lease" and "Thank you for 40 years." He thought about Ray Pruitt's truck in the bank parking lot at 9:40 at night. He thought about the way Ray had said, "Most of these are pretty standard," without quite meeting his eyes. And he thought about the fact that he had not yet told a single person, not Ray, not his sons, not anyone, about Addendum 9D. He put the truck in gear and drove home through the empty county, through the long drought silence, past the fields going gray under a sky the color of old pewter. He had 2 years before the interest rate adjusted, 2 years to be exactly what he appeared to be, a 61-year-old widower, making his minimum payments on time, drawing no attention, giving no indication that anything was different. 2 years of patience. He was very good at patience. The 2 years passed the way hard years do, not quickly, not slowly, but with a kind of grinding inevitability, like a millstone that doesn't hurry and doesn't stop. Everett made his payments. Every month on the 14th, he drove to the Main Street branch and handed a check to the teller window, not mailed, hand-delivered. He wanted a receipt with a timestamp. He kept every receipt in a manila folder in the fireproof lockbox under the bed, the same lockbox where Dot had kept the deed and the mineral survey and the boys' birth certificates. He planted a reduced acreage that first autumn, sold the older combine to Dale Wickham's cousin for $11,000 in cash, which went into an irrevocable trust he had established at a credit union in Middlesboro, Kentucky, 40 miles outside Harlan County, outside the reach of any institution with Consolidated Harvest's fingerprints on it. He sold 2 pieces of equipment he'd been meaning to sell for years and hadn't. He hunted deer in October and November and filled the freezer. He cut his heating oil orders in half and put in 2 more cords of wood than he needed. He did not explain any of this to anyone, to the county, to Ashby's drive-by assessments, to Ray Pruitt, who still came around on Saturday mornings for coffee, as if nothing had changed between them. To all of them, Everett Calloway appeared to be exactly what he was, a 61-year-old widower, quietly struggling through a bad stretch, making ends meet, getting by. The drought eased slightly in the spring of 2022, enough for a partial crop. Not enough to matter. By midsummer, the creek was down again. The fields that had recovered went gray a second time. In August, the state extended the emergency drought declaration. Harlan County remained on the list. Everett read the extension notice in the paper at the kitchen table and set it beside Dot's journal without particular expression. The clock was still running. He watched it happen to his neighbors, the way a doctor watches a disease he cannot yet treat carefully, and with the particular sorrow of someone who understands the mechanism. Dale Wickham's interest rate adjusted in March of 2022. His monthly payment went from $4,200 to $13,400. Dale called Everett on a Tuesday evening, voice-tight, trying to keep it even. He'd called the bank. They had offered a modification package. He read Everett the terms over the phone, and Everett listened without interrupting. And when Dale finished, Everett said, "Don't sign the modification, Dale. Ev, I can't make 13 a month. I know, but the modification resets your clock and buries the original terms. Don't sign it." There was a long silence on the line. "What am I supposed to do instead?" Everett didn't have an answer for him yet. Not one he could give. "Give it a little time," he said, "just a little." Dale ran out of time in October. The Wickham farm, 214 acres, 4 generations, went to summary foreclosure. The auction was held on a cold Thursday morning in the county courthouse parking lot. Everett stood at the back of the small crowd and watched Conrad Ashby confer quietly with 2 men in dark coats who had driven up from Charleston. The bidding lasted 11 minutes. The farm sold to a land management holding company registered in Delaware for $380,000. Dale stood beside his truck with his hands in his pockets and didn't look at anything in particular. The Gentry brothers followed in February, the Hollis family in April. By the autumn of 2023, 9 farms in the valley had gone through foreclosure or forced sale. Ashby's regional acquisition numbers were by any corporate metric exceptional. Everett heard through Ida Pruitt at the hardware counter that Ashby had been mentioned for a promotion. Ida said it the way people in small counties deliver information they want you to have sideways while counting change without looking up. "Mentioned for senior director," she said. "Regional office put out a notice. Dale saw it when he went in to close his account." Everett pocketed his receipt for the fence staples. "That right?" Ida finally looked up. Her eyes were very direct. "You know, my father banked at Blackwater Valley for 40 years. Chester Pruitt was on their board." She let that side for a moment. Chester Pruitt is Ray's father. Everett drove home slowly. He thought about the board. He thought about charter succession. He thought about a paralegal in Columbus on a Friday afternoon copying sections of a 1908 document into a modern contract without reading what they were copying. He thought about what else Ray's father might know. His own rate adjusted in September of 2023. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, certified mail, the way the important ones always did. Monthly payment, $4,100, adjusting to $13,650, effective the 1st of October. Everett read it, standing at the mailbox. He walked back to the house. He pinned the letter to the corkboard above the desk between the property tax receipt and the photo of Dot at the church picnic. He looked at it for a moment, then he went to the kitchen and wrote a check. The check was for $0. He did not mail it. He kept it. A record of a decision. He missed October. He let the phone ring. He threw the warning letters in the kitchen trash without opening them after the first one, which he had read carefully and found to contain no information he didn't already have. He missed November. By December, he was 93 days delinquent. The foreclosure clock under the Heritage Land Relief contract required 90 days of delinquency to trigger summary proceedings. He knew this because he had read every word of the contract. He knew the exact language, the exact timeline, the exact sequence of what would happen next. He drove into town on a Wednesday afternoon and parked in front of a strip of storefronts on Clover Street, between a tax preparation office and a place that sold used furniture. There was a door with frosted glass lettering that read, "Merle Stanton, attorney at law. By appointment." Everett had not made an appointment. He knocked anyway. Merle Stanton was 70 years old and had the rumpled, durable quality of a man who had survived more than one thing he hadn't expected to survive. He had spent 14 years as a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of West Virginia before a case involving a mining company and a sitting state senator had gone sideways in ways that cost him the career but confirmed his opinion of institutions in general. He had come home to Harlan County and opened a small practice and spent the last 16 years handling the legal problems of people who couldn't afford the other kind of lawyer. His office looked like a library that had lost confidence in the filing system. Stacks of manila folders occupied every flat surface. A corkboard behind his desk was layered with papers going back what appeared to be several administrations. The desk itself was buried under open volumes of case law and at least 3 coffee cups in various states of use. Merle looked up from whatever he was reading when Everett came through the door. He looked at Everett the way lawyers look at people who arrive unannounced, measuring the urgency. "I've got a consolidated harvest contract," Everett said. "I need you to read 1 page of it." Merle gestured at the chair across from his desk. "How many pages total?" 380. "You read all of it?" 3 times. Something shifted in Merle's expression. He leaned back. "Sit down, then." Everett sat. He opened the contract to page 312 and set it on the desk, turned to face Merle. He pointed to Addendum 9D without saying anything. Merle read. His reading glasses were perched at the end of his nose, and he had the habit of pressing 2 fingers against his lips when concentrating, which he did now. He read for 4 minutes. He flipped to page 313, looked at the signature blocks, looked at Everett's initials in the margin next to paragraph 4. He took his glasses off. He put them back on. He read it again. "What's the highest appraised value of your land in the last 15 years? The Geological Survey from 2019 put it at 2.1 million. There's an unmined seam on the north slope, low sulfur bituminous. The survey was commissioned by Consolidated Harvest as part of their acquisition assessment of Blackwater Valley." Merle was quiet for a long time. Outside, a truck went down Clover Street. A door banged somewhere in the building. "They paid for the appraisal," Merle said finally. "They did. And now they want to foreclose. They've triggered the 90-day clock. I expect them before Christmas." Merle stood up. For a man with a bad knee, which Everett would learn about later, he moved with surprising energy. He went to the corkboard and stood in front of it with his arms crossed, staring at nothing visible. "They'll claim scrivener's error, copy-paste mistake. The clause doesn't reflect mutual intent." "I know. To beat it, we need to show they knew the addendum was there or that they've used it before." "Chester Pruitt was on the Blackwater Valley board," Everett said. "Ray Pruitt's father. Ray has been working with Ashby. I don't know what Chester knows, but he was there when the charter was active." Merle turned. "I'll find the Nebraska records." Everett looked at him. "These template packages get used regionally," Merle said. "If Consolidated Harvest or any predecessor entity used legacy charter provisions in another state, foreclosure to their benefit, the scrivener's error defense collapses. They can't selectively acknowledge a document." He picked up a legal pad and wrote something. "Give me a week." "I have a little more than that," Everett said, "but not much." He stood to leave. Merle walked him to the door and then paused, hand on the frame. "Everett, when they show up, and they will show up in person, they always do let them initiate. Let them say the words. Make sure there's a witness." "I'll be on the porch," Everett said. He was. The black SUV came up the gravel drive on a Thursday morning in the second week of December, moving slowly, the way vehicles move when the people inside them are confident of their purpose. The sky was the color of old iron. The creek was silent. The apple tree had dropped its leaves, its winter branches tracing dark lines against the pale sky, patient as anything that has outlasted several kinds of weather. Conrad Ashby stepped out first, straightening his coat. Behind him came two men, one who moved with the practiced stillness of private security, one young enough to be a student, carrying a leather briefcase with the careful grip of someone handling something important for the first time. Everett was in the porch rocker, coffee on the railing. He did not stand. Ashby came to the base of the porch steps. His expression was calibrated to project sympathy, the way a contractor's face is calibrated to project regret when he tells you the damage is worse than the estimate. Everett, I'm sorry it came to this. We've sent several notices. You have. We're here to formally initiate foreclosure proceedings on the property at 480 Calloway Hollow Road under the terms of the Heritage Land Relief Agreement. You're 93 days delinquent. The paperwork has been filed with the county clerk. He nodded to the young man with the briefcase, who stepped forward and held out a manila envelope with slightly trembling hands. This is the notice of default and intent to seize. You have 48 hours to vacate. Everett didn't take the envelope. He looked at Ashby. You're initiating formal foreclosure proceedings right now. That's what you're saying. That's correct. All right. He went inside. He came back with the photocopy of page 312, addendum 9D, paragraph 4, marked with a paperclip. He came down the porch steps and handed it to the young lawyer, not to Ashby. Read paragraph 4 out loud, please. The young man looked at Ashby, who nodded with the bored confidence of someone expecting a stalling tactic. The lawyer found the paragraph and began to read. His voice changed at the word replacement. By highest appraised fair market value, it had dropped half a register. By disbursed in full prior to execution of any eviction or transfer of title, he had stopped moving entirely. He stood on the gravel drive in the December cold, holding a piece of paper, and looking Everett thought very much like a man who has just understood something terrible. Mr. Ashby, the young lawyer's voice was careful, the geological survey from the 2019 acquisition assessment, it's in the origination file. The appraisal is $2.1 million. Ashby took the paper. Read it. The color in his face underwent a change not dramatic but definitive, the way a fire looks when the oxygen starts to go. This is legacy boilerplate, Ashby said. This clause was not intended. It's in the contract you drafted, Everett said, signed by both parties. I've initialed the acknowledgement page. You filed foreclosure this morning during an active state drought emergency, which is the triggering condition in paragraph 3. He looked at Ashby steadily. You owe me $2.1 million before you can take 1 acre. The security man had not moved. The young lawyer was staring at his own shoes. Ashby stood very still on the gravel drive, holding the paper, and Everett could see him doing the arithmetic that Everett had done 14 months ago at 3 in the morning, running the numbers, arriving at the same place, finding no exit. This will go to litigation, Ashby said finally. His voice was controlled but thin at the edges. We will contest this clause. We will demonstrate it was included in error. You're welcome to try, Everett said. Merle Stanton is already at the courthouse. He went back up the porch steps. He picked up his coffee. Drive safe, Conrad. He went inside and closed the door. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the silence of the empty house, one hand on the counter, and let himself breathe. His heart was moving faster than he would have liked. He waited for it to slow. He looked at Dot's journal on the table. He thought the first part worked. Now comes the hard part. He was right. The retaliation arrived not as a lawsuit, but as silence. The particular weaponized silence of a large institution applying pressure through channels that leave no fingerprints. His primary operating account at the Harlan branch was frozen within 72 hours pending what a letter described as a routine compliance review of loan origination documentation. The letter was 3 paragraphs and told him nothing except that the freeze could last 30 to 90 days. His credit line at the Farm Supply Cooperative extended annually for the past 11 years, without incident, was declined when he called to place his spring seed order. The woman at the co-op sounded genuinely apologetic. She said she didn't know why. She said it had come from the financing office, not from her. A letter arrived from a seed distributor in Lexington, a company Everett had bought from for 8 years, informing him that his account was under review pending notification from their primary financing partner. Their primary financing partner, as Everett knew from the distributor's invoice header, was a subsidiary of Consolidated Harvest's Regional Commercial Division. They were cutting off the water, every financial tributary feeding the farm one by one without announcement or explanation in ways that would never appear in any single document as coordinated. Everett read each letter, made a note in the margin, and filed it in the manila folder in the lockbox. The money in the Middlesbrough Trust was untouched. They didn't know about it. Or if they did, they couldn't reach it. It had been irrevocably established in Dot's maiden name, Dorothea Vance, with Everett listed only as beneficiary, not account holder. Dot had always had good instincts about what to protect. He didn't need the seed line. He had a freezer full of venison and a pantry he'd been quietly stocking for 14 months. He had 4 cords of firewood and a wood stove that worked. He had no dependents, no employees, no overhead that couldn't be reduced to almost nothing. They were trying to starve a man who had already prepared for famine. But he was under no illusion about the limits of his position. The trust would carry him for 2 years, perhaps 3, if he was careful. A federal lawsuit against a billion-dollar institution without resolution could run longer than that. Merle was good, but he was one man with a bad knee in an office above a used furniture store. On the other side of this was a legal department in Columbus with 300 people and unlimited filing capacity. The bank's strategy, Merle explained when Everett came in on a Friday morning, was attrition. They'll bury us in discovery motions. Every document request takes 60 days. Every response triggers another request. By the time we get to a hearing, they're calculating that your money is gone and your nerve is gone. What do we need? We need to show they've used this addendum before, willfully, to their own advantage. Merle spread 3 folders across the desk. I've been in the federal court database for 2 weeks. I found 2 cases. Both involve heritage charter provisions in foreclosure disputes. Both cite the Blackwater Valley Successor Charter. Which cases? One in Ohio 2017, one in Kentucky 2019. Merle tapped the folders. In both cases, Consolidated Harvest used legacy charter provisions to block bankruptcy filings by distressed borrowers. Provisions from the same addendum structure as 9D, just different paragraphs. Everett was quiet. They can't claim they copy-pasted something they didn't know was there, Merle continued, if they've been using other paragraphs of the same addendum as a weapon in federal court for 6 years. A scrivener's error defense requires that neither party understood the clause to be operative. They understood it. They just expected it to only work one direction. How solid is that argument? In front of the right judge, very solid. Merle leaned back. We need Judge Harwick. He's a textualist. He reads what the contract says, not what the parties claim they meant. If it's in the document and both parties signed, it's binding. Full stop. Can we get Harwick? We file in the Southern District. Harwick's been on that bench for 19 years. Merle looked at Everett over his glasses. There are no guarantees in federal court, Everett. I know. But I've been waiting for a case like this for a long time. Outside it had started to snow. Light early season flakes, the kind that didn't stick. Everett watched them fall past the window and thought about the fields under their first thin white cover, the apple tree standing in the yard with its bare branches holding the gray sky. File it, he said. The community did not organize. There was no meeting, no committee, no petition circulated at the diner counter. What happened was quieter and more durable than any of that. Ida Pruitt began keeping the back corner table at the hardware store free on Tuesday mornings. She made coffee the real kind, not the machine kind, and if Everett happened to come in for anything, there was always a seat and a cup, and she always seemed to have heard something worth mentioning, a name, a document number, a connection she'd turned up by being the kind of woman who had run a community business for 30 years and remembered everything anyone had ever told her. Dike Harmon, the county agricultural inspector, happened to survey Everett's fields in November, recording official soil moisture readings that would form part of the drought emergency file. He took his time. He was thorough. His report, filed with the state office, contained 4 photographs of Sycamore Run reduced to a dry channel of cracked mud, and noted in language more precise than strictly necessary that the contiguous drought condition on the Calloway parcel showed no meaningful amelioration. The Gentry brothers, who had lost their orchard in the spring, showed up one Saturday and split firewood for 4 hours without being asked and without saying much. They left a full rack against the south wall of the barn and drove home. Nobody announced any of this. Nobody coordinated it. It simply happened the way things happen in places where people have known each other long enough to understand that sometimes help doesn't announce itself. Everett noticed all of it. He didn't say much about it either, but at night, sitting at the kitchen table with Dot's journal, he wrote down the names. A list that grew slowly through the winter. He didn't know exactly what for. It felt important to record them. The preliminary hearing was set for the second week of January. 2 days before it, Everett came home from Merle's office to find a truck he didn't recognize parked in his drive. Ray Pruitt was sitting on the porch steps. Everett parked and sat in the truck for a moment. Then he got out and walked to the porch. He didn't say anything. Ray looked up. He was older looking than he had been in the summer. Something had happened to his face in the intervening months, some internal weather event that had left marks. "I know what you think," Ray said. "What do I think?" "That I sold the county out for $47,000. Everett sat down on the step beside him, not next to him, one step below, facing out toward the drive. "I think you needed money and somebody offered it, and you didn't understand what you were actually agreeing to do." Ray was quiet. "I think you watched Dale Wickham lose his farm and realized what you'd been part of," Everett said. "And I think that's been sitting with you since October. I should have told you. You should have." The silence between them was different from the silence of their falling out. That silence had been hard and final. This one was something still being worked out, still unresolved, with some possibility of resolution in it somewhere, if neither of them pushed too hard. "What Ashby told us," Ray said slowly, "when he brought us into the program, the brokers. I mean, he said the heritage contracts were standard. He said the rate adjustments were disclosed. He said we were helping families access capital they wouldn't otherwise get." Ray looked at his hands. "He didn't tell us about the adjustment timeline. He didn't tell us what happened when the rate tripled. We found out the same time the families did." "Would you say that in court?" Ray looked up. "Not about me," Everett said. "About the pattern, about what Ashby told the brokers, what the pitch was, what was left out." The preliminary hearing was 3 days away. There was still time to add a witness. A long pause. A car went down the road at the bottom of the drive, headlights tracking through the bare trees. "Yeah," Ray said. "I'd say it." Everett nodded. He stood up. He went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Ray without ceremony. They sat on the porch steps in the January cold and drank their coffee and didn't talk about much else. After a while, Ray drove home. Everett went to the kitchen table. He opened Dot's journal. He added Ray's name to the list. The federal courthouse in Charleston was a limestone building designed to make individuals feel appropriately small. Everett wore his Sunday suit, the gray one, last worn at Dot's funeral. It still fit, which he took as a neutral sign. Merle argued for 40 minutes. The bank's lead attorney, a man named Forsyth, imported from the Columbus office, aggressively polished, moved to strike Addendum 9D under Scrivener's error doctrine with the confidence of a man who had made this argument many times before and had it work. Merle let him finish. Then Merle stood up and placed 2 folders on the judge's bench. The Ohio case, the Kentucky case, both bearing Consolidated Harvest's name on the plaintiff's brief, both citing heritage charter addendum provisions as binding and enforceable, both decided in the bank's favor because the judge had agreed legacy charter language, once included in a signed successor agreement, was operative and could not be selectively dismissed. Forsyth's expression didn't change, but his hands shuffling papers went very still. "The bank cannot enforce the addendum in Ohio and Kentucky," Merle said, "and then stand here in West Virginia and call it a typo." Judge Harwick read both cases from the bench. He read them carefully, which took time. The courtroom was very quiet. Everett sat with his hands folded and looked at the middle distance and breathed slowly. "The motion to strike is denied," Harwick said. "Addendum 9D is binding on both parties. Consolidated Harvest Bank is enjoined from any foreclosure or eviction action against the Calloway parcel until the replacement value of $2,100,000 is disbursed in full." The gavel came down. Merle sat back in his chair with a long, careful exhale, like a man releasing pressure he had been holding for months. Everett didn't move for a moment. Then he buttoned his jacket and stood. He walked past the plaintiff's table. Forsyth was already on his phone, back turned. Everett didn't stop. He walked through the heavy oak doors into the corridor, where the sound from the courtroom fell away, and there was just the hum of the building's heating system and the muted winter light coming through the high windows. He stood there for a moment. He put his hand in his coat pocket and touched the edge of Dot's journal, which he had carried in his inside pocket all morning. He had won the hearing. He knew that. He also knew it wasn't over. The bank had not written a check. They had been ordered to write one. Those were different things. A bank with 300 lawyers and $1 billion balance sheet and a genuine existential reason to avoid paying that was not a bank that would comply quietly. What came next would be worse than what had come before. On the drive back to Harlan, the snow started again. Heavier this time, real accumulation. Everett drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, watching the road ahead. The radio said the system would intensify overnight. The whole county would be white by morning. His phone rang on the seat beside him. He glanced at it. A Columbus area code he didn't recognize. He let it ring. 3 miles from home, his phone rang again. Same number. He let it ring again. When he turned onto Calloway Hollow Road, he saw a vehicle parked at the end of his drive. Not a bank SUV this time. A state vehicle, a white sedan with government plates, and a seal on the door he couldn't read from the distance. He pulled up and got out. A man in a gray uniform came forward. State Agricultural Authority, Harlan District Office. "Mr. Calloway, I'm sorry to come out in this weather. I've been sent to do a formal reassessment of the drought classification on your parcel." Everett looked at the man. He was young, he looked uncomfortable. "Who sent the request?" "It came through the state office, sir. A petition from he checked his clipboard, a legal firm in Columbus, Forsyth and Partners. They're arguing that recent precipitation may warrant a revision to the emergency drought status." Everett looked up at the sky. It was white and heavy and delivering snow at a rate that had not been seen in the county since February of 2019. "You're here to reassess the drought," Everett said carefully, "during a snowstorm." The young man looked at his clipboard. He looked at the sky. He looked at Everett. He had the expression of a person who has just understood fully and completely the absurdity of his errand. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think I may need to reschedule." "I think that would be wise," Everett said. He watched the state vehicle back down his drive and disappear into the white. He stood in the snow for a moment alone on the road, the fields spreading white in every direction. The bank had just tried to pull the floor out from under the entire case, not through the courts, but through a state regulatory petition designed to invalidate the drought emergency that was the triggering condition for Addendum 9D, no drought emergency, no trigger, no trigger, no 2.1 million, no 2.1 million, and Forsyth files a motion to dissolve the injunction by Friday. If they succeeded, everything Merle had won that morning would dissolve like the flakes landing in Everett's hand. He took out his phone and called Merle. "They've filed a petition to revoke the drought emergency status," he said when Merle picked up. "Forsyth and Partners. They sent a state inspector to my field today." Merle was quiet for 3 seconds. "How many of the other families still have active drought classifications on record?" "All 17 who signed heritage contracts. Same county, same emergency declaration." "Then it's not just your classification they'd have to revoke," Merle said slowly. "It's all of them. They'd have to prove the entire county drought declaration was invalid in January, during a snowstorm." "Can they do it?" Another pause. Longer this time. "They can try. And if they try, Everett, they're going to go after every farm in that declaration, every soil moisture record, every inspector's report. They'll use the political pressure on the state office. They have money and they have time, and they know we're nearly out of one of those things." The snow was coming harder now. The apple tree at the corner of the yard was disappearing into the white, its bare branches holding a thin coat of early accumulation, stubborn and patient as anything that has lasted long enough to know that weather passes. "Merle," Everett said, "get everyone together, all 17 families." "That's a big ask, Ev." These people have already lost. I know what they've lost, Everett said. Get them together. I have something to show them. He hung up. He stood in the snow a moment longer. The county was silent around him, going white, erasing the boundary lines between one piece of land and the next, until everything was the same unbroken field, under the same unbroken sky. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened Dot's journal to the list of names he had been keeping since October and read it through from top to bottom. 17 families, 17 sets of papers, 17 copies of the same Heritage Land Relief contract with the same 380 pages and the same Addendum 9D and the same paragraph 4 sitting at page 312, like a quiet, patient bomb in every one of them. The bank thought it was fighting one farmer. It had not yet understood what it was actually fighting. The meeting happened on a Saturday. Merle made the calls. Ida spread the word through the hardware store and the Tuesday coffee corner and the particular telephone network that runs through small counties, like groundwater, invisible everywhere, reliable in ways the official systems never quite manage to be. By 10 o'clock on a gray January morning, 17 families had come to the Harlan County Grange Hall on Route 7, a building that smelled of old wood and stored grain and the accumulated weight of 100 years of hard agricultural decisions. They came in quietly. The Gentry brothers, the Hollis family, Dale Wickham, who no longer had land to protect, but came anyway, sitting in the back row with his coat still on, as if he might need to leave quickly. Families whose names Everett had been writing in Dot's journal since October, names that had become, over the months of watching and waiting, something more than a list. Everett stood at the front of the room. He was not a man who liked standing at the front of rooms. He would have preferred to sit in the back, the way he always had at the Farm Bureau meetings, watching and listening. But Merle had said quietly on the drive over, "They need to see you, Ev, not me, you." So he stood, and he looked at the faces worn cautious people who had been disappointed by enough promises that they had developed a useful immunity to hope. He didn't make a speech. He set a copy of page 312 on the table in front of him. He explained in the plain language of a man describing a mechanical problem what the clause said, what it meant, and what it required. He explained that every Heritage Land Relief contract in the room contained the same addendum. He explained that the bank's foreclosure on his property had legally activated a ruling that now applied as precedent to every parcel in the room. He explained that the bank understood this, and that they were now attempting to revoke the state drought emergency declaration to eliminate the triggering condition before any of the other families reached their 90-day delinquency window. The room was very quiet when he finished. A woman in the third row, Margaret Hollis, who had lost her family's tobacco allotment in April and had not, as far as Everett knew, spoken publicly about any of it, raised her hand. "What do you need from us?" "Your soil moisture records," Everett said. "Every inspection report, every state assessment, every photograph you have of your land from the last 2 years. We're going to make it impossible for a law firm in Columbus to argue that this county isn't in drought." He paused. "Dick Harmon has agreed to coordinate the documentation. He'll be at the county extension office Monday morning. If you bring what you have, he'll certify it and file it with the State Agricultural Board before the end of the week." Dale Wickham spoke from the back of the room, voice low. What about those of us who already lost our farms? Everett looked at him. That's the second thing I need to talk to you about. What followed was not dramatic. It rarely is when the real work is happening. It was 3 weeks of documentation filing and the particular grinding labor of assembling an irrefutable record from the handwritten notes and crumpled receipts and careful personal logs of 17 farming families. Dick Harmon turned out to be extraordinary in a crisis. He worked 12-hour days at the extension office certifying moisture readings, cross-referencing historical precipitation data, building a county-wide drought record that ran to 400 pages and was, when finished, the most comprehensively documented agricultural emergency in Harlan County history. He submitted it to the state board with a cover letter that politely but surgically dismantled every factual claim in Forsyth's petition. The state board, faced with 400 pages of certified field data on one side and a Columbus law firm's assertion on the other, declined to revoke the emergency declaration. The drought classification held. Forsyth filed 2 more motions. Merle answered both. Judge Harwick denied both in language that grew progressively less patient with each filing until the third denial contained a sentence that Merle read aloud to Everett in the extension office parking lot with quiet satisfaction. The court notes that the plaintiff's repeated attempts to relitigate matters already decided suggest an unwillingness to comply with the court's prior order rather than a good-faith dispute about legal principles. He's annoyed, Merle said, folding the document. Good, Everett said. The letter from Consolidated Harvest Board arrived on a Tuesday in late February, addressed to Merle's office. It requested a meeting without prejudice to discuss resolution. No location was specified. Merle called Everett. Everett said he would consider where the meeting should be held. He thought about it for 2 days. He thought about Ashby's corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its mahogany desk and its deliberate architecture of institutional power, the cold air, the marble, the weight of the space, designed to make a man feel small before anyone said a word. He called Merle back. "My kitchen," he said. "Tuesday morning. Tell them to bring whoever makes final decisions." Nolan Vress arrived alone. That was the first surprise. No junior associates, no security, no Forsyth with his polished cuffs and his Columbus confidence. Just a 63-year-old CEO in a good wool coat stepping out of a hired car onto the gravel drive of a West Virginia farm on a February morning, looking for the first time in what was probably a long time like a man without significant backup. Everett watched him from the kitchen window. Vress stood for a moment in the drive looking at the fields, the barn, the apple tree at the yard's corner. Its bare branches held a thin skin of ice from the previous night's freeze, each twig outlined in white catching the flat winter light. He looked at it the way men sometimes look at things that are older than they expected. Then he came to the door. Everett let him knock once before opening it. The kitchen table held 3 things, 2 mugs of coffee, Dot's journal set to one side, and a manila folder. Merle was already seated, his bad knee stretched carefully under the table, his legal pad open. Vress sat across from them. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. For a man accustomed to boardrooms, he seemed less uncomfortable in this kitchen than Everett would have expected. Either he had grown up somewhere like this, or he was wise enough to know that performance wouldn't serve him here. "You've won the injunction," Vress said. We can't foreclose while it stands. We both know an appeal would take 2 years and land us on the front page of every agricultural publication in the country. He looked at Everett. What do you want? Everett slid the cashier's check across the table. Vress had placed it there when he sat down. $2,100,000 made out to Everett Calloway. Everett pushed it back toward the center of the table, not toward Vress, but not pocketed either. A placeholder, a starting point. That's mine regardless, Everett said. That's the clause you triggered. That's not negotiable, and it's not what this meeting is about. Vress waited. Merlot opened the manila folder and laid 17 documents on the table, arranged in a grid. Each one was a signature page from a heritage land relief contract with the borrower's name at the top and addendum 9D flagged at the bottom. 17 properties, Merle said, all in active drought emergency, all approaching or past the 90-day delinquency window, all with the same clause, all covered by the same precedent Judge Harwick established in January. Vress looked at the grid of pages. His expression did not change, but something behind it did a small, careful recalibration. If you proceed on any of them, Everett said, Merle represents them. Harwick's already seen the pattern. You won't get a different result. He leaned forward slightly. And if you spend the next 2 years fighting 17 separate federal injunctions, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau complaint we filed in January becomes a pattern of practice investigation. That's not a lawsuit, that's a regulatory action, different timeline, different exposure, different kind of damage to a publicly traded institution. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird moved through the apple tree, the ice on the branches chiming softly as the twigs shifted. Vress set down his coffee. What are the terms? Everett had drafted the terms with Merle over 4 evenings at the kitchen table. He read them now from the folder. Fixed interest rate of 3.5% for the life of all 17 heritage land relief loans. Balloon payments eliminated, arrears from the adjustment period forgiven. The 2 properties whose foreclosures were potentially reversible, the Hollis parcel and a small farm belonging to a widow named Eugenia Fant, to be returned at the original loan principal, no additional costs. And one more thing, Dale Wickham's farm, Everett said. Vress frowned. The Wickham property was sold. The buyer? The buyer is Consolidated Harvest Agricultural Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware, Merle said. You've been holding it, waiting for the Highway Corridor Survey to complete. A pause, long enough that it was its own kind of answer. You sell it back to Dale Wickham at the principal he owed when you took it, Everett said. That's $260,000. You paid $380 at auction. You'll absorb the difference. Vress looked at the table, at the 17 pages, at the cashier's check sitting in the center of the tableau like a starting bid. You're asking me to reverse 4 years of regional acquisition strategy, he said. It wasn't an objection. It was more like a man stating the full weight of something before he picks it up. I'm asking you to honor the document you wrote, Everett said. Vress signed for 2 hours. Merle had prepared the restructuring agreements in advance, 16 of them, 1 per remaining property, plus the 2 reversals and the Wickham resale. He produced them from his briefcase, one at a time, methodically, with the practiced patience of a man who had spent decades waiting for a morning like this one. Vress read each document before signing. Everett noticed that he did not comment on it. When the last page was signed and Merle had collected everything into his case, Vress stood and buttoned his coat. He looked at Everett across the kitchen table. There was no warmth between them, and there was no hatred either, something more like the recognition between two people who have tested each other's limits and arrived at a mutual understanding of where those limits are. "You could have fought this quietly," Vress said. "Just your farm, collected the 2 million and walked away." "I could have," Everett said. "Why didn't you?" Everett was quiet for a moment. He looked at the journal on the table. "Because the land doesn't stop at my fence line," he said. Vress nodded once. He picked up his coat and walked to the door. He opened it and stepped out into the February morning and got into the hired car without looking back, and the car went down the gravel drive and turned onto Calloway Hollow Road and was gone. The kitchen was very quiet. Merle let out a breath so long and deliberate it might have been the last breath of the preceding 2 years, compressed and finally released. He looked at the stack of signed documents in his case. He looked at Everett. He started to say something and stopped and then just shook his head slowly, a single motion that contained more than most speeches. "Go call Dale," Merle said finally. Everett called Dale from the porch. Dale didn't say anything for a long time when Everett told him. Then his voice came through the phone with a thickness in it that neither of them acknowledged. "When can I go back out there?" "Whenever you want," Everett said. "It's yours." He stayed on the porch after the call ended. He slid the phone into his pocket and stood looking out at the farm in the February afternoon. The light at that hour in winter in the eastern Kentucky hills is a particular thing. It comes in low and long and yellow-white, the kind of light that doesn't illuminate so much as it reveals, making the texture of things visible, the grain of the fence posts, the individual blades of dormant grass pressing up through the frost, the small architecture of bare branches against the pale sky. Everything in that light looks like it has been there a long time and intends to continue. The apple tree stood at the corner of the yard in that light. Its branches were still bare, still laced with the remnants of the morning's ice, which had mostly melted now in the afternoon warmth, except for the places deepest in the shadow where small bright slivers still caught and held what light reached them. The tree was enormous, up close. The circumference of its trunk required 2 arms to span with bark so deeply furrowed it looked like a topographic map of something. Cormac Calloway had planted it in 1931 with what he had left after the Depression, took everything else in soil that other people had written off in a year when the future was not an obvious proposition. It had not grown fast. It had not grown easily. It had simply grown with the slow, inexorable patience of something that had put its roots down far enough that no surface condition, drought, winter, the passage of men, and their arrangements could find them. Everett walked across the yard and put his hand on the bark. It was cold and rough under his palm, textured like nothing that was made. Under his hand he could feel nothing moving, no pulse, no warmth. And yet he stood there for a while. Then he went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened Dot's journal. Not to the last page, not to the list of names. He turned to a page from 7 years earlier, written in the spring Dot's handwriting, the careful, slightly left-leaning script she'd had since grade school. Planted the kitchen garden today. Ev said the soil was too compacted on the east side to bother with. I planted it anyway. You don't find out what the ground can hold until you ask it. He read the sentence twice. He closed the journal. He set it on the table in front of him, the worn brown leather, the soft corners, the small brass clasp that didn't quite close anymore, and he left his hand resting on the cover for a moment. Outside, the afternoon light was going. The apple tree was becoming a silhouette against the pale winter sky, its shape growing simpler as the details disappeared until it was only a form, a central line branching, spreading, holding the last of the cold light at its outermost edges. In the valley below the farm, through the bare hillside timber, a light came on in the Weekham place. Then another. Dale was already home. Somewhere in the last of the afternoon something eased. Not the land had always been what it was, not the county which would take years to fully recover and might never completely, but something in the architecture of the situation, some long-held tension in the structure of things, released with a quietness so complete that it was almost the same as silence. Almost, but not quite. Because silence is empty, and this was full. If you've ever held on to something that was yours, a piece of ground, a promise, a principle someone told you wasn't worth fighting for, then you know what Everett Calloway understood standing at that kitchen table in the February evening with his hand on his wife's journal. Some things don't survive because they're strong. They survive because their roots went down when no one was watching, in the years before the drought, in the ordinary seasons when the ground was soft enough to take them. And when the hard years came, and the hard years always come, there was simply nothing left to pull up. The apple tree in the yard had not grown because conditions were favorable. It had grown because Cormac Calloway had put it in the ground and walked away and trusted it to do what trees do, which is outlast the things that try to stop them. Everett turned off the kitchen light. He stood for a moment in the dark, looking out the window at the yard, at the last visible shape of the tree against the last visible light. Then he went to make dinner the way a man does when the day's work is finished and tomorrow is still coming, and there are things in the freezer and wood in the stove, and for the first time in 2 years, no letter in the mailbox that he's afraid to open. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And tell us in the comments, has there ever been a moment when patience turned out to be the most powerful thing you had? End.